Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening, people from all over the world. I'm delighted to say that Mr. Barry Humphreys, who is the author of this, I think, really very good book, is with us today, and I'm really happy that he is. Barry, your background makes you absolutely ideally suited to write this book. You were first in the CAA and in the UK, and also then in the regulatory department of Virgin. What is the book about? How would you introduce the book?
Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Andrew. Well, the book is part of a series edited by John King and Peter Bruce in Australia called Managing Aviation Operations, and the series is really intended for practitioners in the industry, but as is often the case, I either misunderstood or just ignored my instructions. So it's a rather odd book in that series. It's much longer than the other books, and it's certainly aimed at practitioners in the industry, but I hope also will be useful to academics as well. The book is in two parts, really. The first part traces the development, the history, if you like, of air transport regulation all the way back to the Chicago Convention of 1944. And I make no apology for focusing on the history in that way, because I'm a great believer in the fact that you can't really hope to address the problems of today unless you understand how those problems arose. And it's one of the oddities, in my view, of the aviation industry, that many of the problems we face today can indeed be traced back many, many decades. So that's the first half of the book. The second half focuses on individual areas, such as airport regulation, ATC regulation, the environment, technology, ownership and control rules, which in my view are extremely important, profitability of the airline industry, where I argue that, excuse me, the airlines in particular are a failed industry, and so forth. So two parts, and aimed very much at participants in the industry and academics, in summary, Andrew. Thank you.
Okay, so you just said then, Barry, and I think it's fair to say that it's a book in two parts, but also aviation regulation, if you like, has got two parts as well. Let's come to the second part, which is ATC and airports and all those other things in a moment. But just the story of regulation for aviation is that we started in 1944, for want of a better place to start, and then come the 80s, there was a bit of the liberalisation, which is in the title of the book. And then there's been a sort of a reverse from that since. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I think I'd be a bit more expansive than that. I think we start off with an industry that was very much government created and government controlled. Indeed, a combination of government and industry. The creation of ICAO, of course, coincided with the creation of IATA, and the two worked very closely together for many years. So for many years, you had a very protectionist industry. And then you have a series of liberalizations. And I come from the standpoint that liberalization is a good thing. It benefits all stakeholders eventually, and not least, of course, the consumer, where we've seen substantial reductions in fares and increases in competition. But even during the most protectionist period, aviation did some strange things. We often think of, for example, the low-cost carriers today as being a new phenomenon. They're not new at all. We had charters in the protectionist period. Charter services sort of crept under the radar of regulation. People weren't all that interested in charters. And we reached a point, people forget this, again, this is an example of how history can give you a different perspective. People forget that in Europe, half of all air services at one stage were inclusive tour charters. Half of them, just as today, a very large proportion are low cost services, and the charters, of course, provided low fares for people and expanded the industry, as did technology with its reductions in fares. So yes, liberalisation then came, and it made quite significant progress, very significant progress over a number of years. You have US deregulation, you have European liberalisation, you have the open skies deals, but then it reached a full stop, almost a full stop.
Why did it reach a full stop?
Because it reached a point where the main outstanding issue, and it's an extremely important issue, it's an issue that has dictated the profitability and the structure of the industry, in my opinion. That's the restrictions on who can own and control an airline. They proved to be a step too far. The great hope, I think, was the EU-US negotiations. Perhaps I could just backtrack a little bit, because the key thing about the ownership and control rules is that you can't reform them bilaterally. Open skies, in terms of the normal freedoms of the air, can all be agreed between two countries or two groups of countries, and it works. Australia and the US can agree that any number of airlines can fly, that they can have freedom to charge what they want, and so forth. But when it comes to ownership and control, that doesn't work, because if Australia and America agree to abandon the ownership and control rules for their citizens, that's fine for airlines in Australia who want to operate between Australia and the United States. But those airlines also want to operate to other countries, and there the ownership and control rules would still apply, and therefore the reform would be meaningless. So you need a multilateral approach, and the nearest we got to that, and I discussed this in some detail in my book, the nearest we got was the EU-US negotiations for a transatlantic open aviation area, where at that time those two groups accounted for something like nearly 60% of scheduled aviation in the world. So a big chunk. And if they'd have reached agreement, you could have expected, I would assume, other liberal-minded countries like Canada, Australia, and so forth, to join in. So you'd have a momentum that would probably be unstoppable, and thereby reform those archaic rules. But it didn't work. The Americans refused to play ball because of restrictionist arguments among the unions, and the whole thing fell down. So there was a failure, and since then, no obvious area where such reform can be taken forward. So we reached an impasse.
We've reached an impasse, but that, and you described it as a full stop, but your book is actually titled To Liberalisation and Back. Do you think there's some backstepping or backward walking going on at the moment?
Yeah, very, very much so, for a number of reasons. For example, there's a global and anti-globalization movement, I think, affecting all.
The only thing they've globalized is the anti-globalization.
That's right, yes. This growth of protectionism, which we see in many countries for a variety of reasons, and aviation isn't immune to that. So there's a general feeling against further liberalization. Also, we see the growth of protectionism, for example, in the reaction to the emergence of the Gulf carriers. Very strong pushback from a number of legacy carriers who feared the competition provided and received some support from their governments. Not total support, but some support. Began in Europe with Air France and Lufthansa, and then spread to the United States. So that has had an impact, I think, as well. And there are a number of other issues that point to a slowdown. Brexit, for example, believe it or not, I think is is an example, not because of of the policy itself, but because the withdrawal of the UK from the EU means that the Commission no longer have the support of a major European country in their liberalisation policies. The Commission has always been very liberal towards aviation, and with the UK, of course, helped to, and a number of other smaller countries, helped to counter the more restrictive policies proposed and supported by countries like France and Germany. So the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, I think, is a very negative development, and you can see that now in the negotiations that the EU carries out. It's almost unthinkable today for the EU to propose the type of policy that they proposed to the United States, which was essentially to take the EU internal market and stretch it across the Atlantic.
But I mean, that raises two issues. Well, first of all, let me, as an aside, say I think Brexit is also a perfect example of the anti-globalisation trend. And although I take your point that it had significant further knock-on for air transport, but even at the peak of the liberalisation, the United States has a much more restrictive view on ownership and control than Europe, and indeed, it's fair to say most of the rest of the world. Is that, but yet somehow we were able to overcome that. How does that work?
Well, first of all, I don't think I quite agree with you there. I mean, I participated in virtually all of the negotiations, both between the UK and US, and then the EU and US on this very subject. And, you know, we were remarkably close to an agreement.
No, sorry, what I meant though was, what I meant was at the moment in the US, the foreign ownership limit is capped at 25%.
Yeah.
Of voting shares, whereas it's in effect 50% for Europe. That was the sort of difference that I was meaning. But but I'm also very interested to hear how close you were to.
All right.
To
okay.
That
so no, I think the two are connected. They have very restrictive rules, more restrictive than most countries, and they apply them very rigidly. But there were only two oppositions during the EU-US talks. Only two groups opposed the reform of the ownership and control rules, and that were the unions, and particularly the pilots' unions, and also the Pentagon, who have. I mean, I don't want to go into too much complexity, but they have this Fly America policy and so forth, which meant that they actually like to have US owned airlines, but. I mean, I think the Pentagon issue was very obviously solvable. That wasn't a really long-term issue. It was the unions and the way in which they lobbied the Congress and so forth, and it was proved to be a hurdle too far. But I had absolutely no doubt that the rest of the US government was more than happy to reform these rules. The EU came very close, actually, to achieving this. Now, you might say, well, that was then and this is now, and things have changed, and that's very, very true. And there's no real pressure anymore to change the rules, not that I detect anyway. And perhaps this is where academics could play a greater role. Academics played a very important role in the original deregulation of US domestic air services, very significant indeed. And maybe they could play a role here as well, but I don't see it at the moment.
A call to arms for academics. What I mean, a number of topics to go through there. Let's just, perhaps it helps if I it helps stimulate academic thinking. Let's talk about the Gulf carriers and the campaign we've seen by the Lufthansa, Air France, KLM and others against the Gulf carriers. That's a classic example, isn't it, of exactly the same sort of thing of which you speak?
Oh, most definitely, yes, and I mean it shows the latent restrictionism that's still very common among the legacy carriers. A number of them, they talk the talk of competition and freedom of action, but they actually quite like the cozy relationship with their governments and protectionism. And I suspect they're no different from many other industries in that respect.
If you could get away with it, why wouldn't you?
The big difference is, which I hinted at before, and you can see it when you look at the way regulation developed in the early years in particular. The big difference, I think, in aviation is there is still this very close relationship, uncomfortably close relationship between governments and their major airlines. And you saw that during COVID in particular, and it continues. Obviously, in the early years, that relationship, they were totally intertwined. But nowadays, again, governments talk the talk of competition and encouraging new entrants and so forth. But when it comes to to be challenged, they tend to most of them tend to favour their major legacy carriers. Not all by any means, but most.
But so where does that take us? I mean, does that mean that we're wasting our time trying to build a more competitive aviation industry? I mean, the barriers to entry are traditionally quite high anyway for aviation. Should we just give up and just settle with what we've got?
No, I don't think so. I think the potential gains from further liberalisation are so large that it's worth continuing. I mean, I'm not overly optimistic that success will come in the near future, but I think it is there. I mean, we haven't touched on some of the implications of these restrictions that still are in place. And
what are the implications on these restrictions, Barry?
They highlight the gains to be had. I argue in the book that the very structure of the industry that we have today, the airline industry, stems very much from the retention of these ownership and control rules and the inability of airlines to freely merge across borders in the way companies in other industries do. Excuse me. I mean, it means that this most international of businesses doesn't have a single global company. There isn't. All airlines, that there are examples of airlines cooperating across borders, even merging across borders to a limited extent, but they're not truly global companies. They're still very much nation-based. Lufthansa is still German, Qantas is still Australian, and so forth and so forth. And that stems almost wholly from these ownership and control rules, which, while they're being chipped away, they still present a major risk for potential investors. And we see examples, not all that common, but there are examples of ways of airlines being prevented from operating in a normal commercial way because of objections to their ownership structures. We also see, of course, the creation of these alliances, the Star, One World, Sky Team, which have emerged, in my view, purely because of the ownership and control rules, purely because airlines can't act as normal companies would and merge fully. And so you get this second best option, which is highly unstable, doesn't achieve the same benefits that a full merger would, but nevertheless are now dominate the industry.
Alliances are at best a workaround, and if you've got a workaround, you've already admitted the system isn't working well. Let me go back for everybody listening. Let me go back and go through the fundamental building blocks. What happened in Chicago in 1944? And I read the Chicago Convention from cover to cover because I'm that kind of sad person, but you'll never see the expression ownership and control mentioned in the convention. So Talk me through a little bit of the history there.
Well, the Chicago Convention was a success and a failure.
Someone has got their microphone on. Could they please ensure they're on mute?
Okay.
Carry on, Barry.
So Chicago was a success and a failure. It was a success in terms that it established the basis for safety regulation globally, and that's been a great success. You can argue about the bureaucracy of ICAO and so forth, but fundamentally we have an incredibly safe industry, and a lot of the reason for that can be traced back to Chicago and the system put in place. On the other hand, it failed totally on the economic side. It failed to establish a multilateral approach to the regulation of air transport because of this major difference of opinion between the United States, which wanted freedom, and the UK, which wanted tight control, and their associated allies. So it failed, and thereby led, and that's why there's no reference to ownership and control, but it led directly to the bilateral system of interstate treaty negotiations to enable air services to operate. And as soon as you get bilateral negotiations, the ownership and control rules follow almost inevitably, because if you're negotiating with another country for rights for your airlines, the last thing you want is for third countries to be freeloaders and to come in and take advantage of what you have negotiated. And therefore, these ownership rules were put in place so that to ensure that the benefits of bilateral negotiations flowed to the to citizens of the country doing the negotiation, and that's the origin of it all. So we've since moved a long way away from the origin, the original Bermuda One type of negotiation, but these rules are still in place, and they prove to be very difficult to shift.
They're difficult to shift because states perceive, am I right in saying they're difficult to shift because for whatever reason, states perceive they have a benefit from keeping things inside under their own control? Why are they so? I'm running out of reasons why we want to keep them.
I've attended many conferences, seminars on this very subject, and I cannot remember any that came even remotely close to agreeing that these rules are a sensible approach. There is universal agreement among people like us, the participants in this webinar, on that this is a silly, stupid way of running any industry. So and governments aren't stupid either. I mean, they must realize that as well. But of course, other interests then affect. And I mean, and just look at the way what happened in the US during the EU-US talks. I keep coming back to that, but it was quite a key point in the development of aviation. The opposition didn't really come from any logical source at all. Came essentially from the pilots' unions who were arguing that they would lose work to Europeans if these rules were removed and you had a free-for-all, an open market. Of course, at the same time, the pilots' unions for the Europeans in Europe were arguing exactly the same, that European pilots would lose jobs to the Americans. Well, now they can't both have been right. They could both have been wrong, and I think they were both wrong. But that just shows you we shouldn't look for logic in this. This is pure self-interest, and sometimes misguided self-interest as well.
Talking about pilots and talking about self-interest, how on earth do they crash in together? And I'm guessing, Barry, given that we are talking about the pilots, the safety card was played as well, was it?
Oh yes, undoubtedly, yes. But I don't think anybody really took that too seriously.
Good. I'm pleased to hear that. What about, again, when you earlier on you were saying that the start of all of this was a joint venture. That wasn't a word you used, but a joint venture between IATA and ICAO. And early on, airfares were strictly controlled, indeed controlled by the governments and managed by IATA. When did that start to break down?
Well, gradually over many years. I mean, you're right. It was ridiculously tightly controlled. You know, the infamous IATA prawn sandwich, I think. Which, if you want the details of that, you'll have to go to my book. Incidentally, I try in my book. It's a very dry subject, this, of course, but I do try.
Come on, the thickness of sandwiches is never a dry subject.
I do try to put in a few lighter anecdotes in there, and I always find the prawn sandwich is a perfect example. The IATA actually, what happened was that airlines agreed to tightly control fares and collude on the setting of fares and so on. In fact, in virtually all of the early bilateral agreements, airlines were required to collude on fares. They weren't just allowed to; they were required to. But that being airlines, of course, they decided to try and find ways of cheating. And so while they all charged superficially the same fare, they started offering added amenities for the fare. So that was regarded as highly unfair, and inspectors were sent around to examine what was being offered to passengers. And the prawn sandwich was regarded, I forget offhand the exact circumstances, but it was regarded as a step too far, as was the offering of beer by Scandinavian carriers. They argued that all Scandinavians required beer, so they should be allowed to offer it for free. And the IATA said, no, it's far too much. But that's the sort of tight control. And then gradually that started to break down, mostly because the airlines cheated right, left and centre. And then, of course, you have liberalisation coming along, which did away with all this nonsense. But I mean, I spent a significant part of my early career, to my great shame, setting airfares. I mean, we had at the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK twice a year a major hearing where all the airlines would come together to ask for fare increases on domestic routes. IATA took care of the international. And I mean, it was a significant hearing. It lasted days. The chairman of the CAA actually chaired the panel, and it was a serious thing. And they decided, yes, you can have a £1 increase in the fare between Glasgow and London. And it was just such nonsense. It really was. But that's the way we spent our time.
As an ex-airline employee, Barry, we call them the good old days.
Yeah,
I can. As to the inspectors, it actually extended down into what the travel agents were doing. And when I worked at Qantas, we were still in what was called the YIP, the Yield Improvement Program, where inspectors would go around and check that the travel agents were charging the fully published fare.
And sorry to interrupt. There was also even the cheating was formalised.
Oh, good. Well, as it should be.
Hey, you're talking about the Europe-Australia route, the kangaroo route. There were different levels at which airlines were allowed to discount. Discounting was illegal, but it was agreed that they had sort of quality checks on airlines. So the top airlines charged a full fare, and then the second level airlines were allowed to discount a bit, and the third levels a bit more. You can imagine where so it was formalized cheating.
the good old days, Barry. The good old days. I remember them well. So let's bring this part of this conversation together. We have this incredibly rigid supranational, sorry, that was Freudian, supranational framework. And we have a very uncompetitive or frankly collusive arrangement as to the fares and how we treat customers and what we feed them and how much beer they get and so forth. The first bit hasn't changed very much at all, the structure of the industry, the structure of the regulation of the industry, but the competitive side really has. What caused that change?
Well, I think no single development. Obviously, the liberalisation activity, the US deregulation, European liberalisation, all played a big part. But you had competition coming in even when under the old tight regime. I mentioned before the charters. Charters were very significant, especially in Europe. And they forced the legacy carriers to amend their ways in many, many ways, and gradually broke down some of the more restrictive elements. So it's I mean there were many elements, and over a long period, which I tried to summarize in my book, all leading up to this outbreak of open competition, which as I say, I think has been very beneficial to all stakeholders.
Right, including the airlines, in fact. I was going to ask you that earlier. I mean, you mentioned that deregulation had been very good for the passengers. Has it been good for the airlines? We have fewer, well, do we? I nearly said we have fewer airlines than we used to, but I don't think that's true.
I don't think that's right. And you mentioned before that the barriers to entry to the industry are high. I think that's true to some extent, but not universally true. I think the safety elements are certainly high. It's quite difficult to get the safety approvals, but the economic barriers are relatively low. So as long as you've got some money, basically, you can go in. And there's, you know, I was looking at some figures the other day. Post-COVID, a lot of airlines went out of business during COVID, the smaller ones in particular, but many more actually started up. There were more airlines as a result of COVID, well, not as a result of, but following COVID than there was before. So there's no sign. I mean, why people want to throw money into airlines, I do not know, because the airline industry has been a massive loss maker. I call it a failed industry in the book.
Well, I was coming to that. Yes, indeed. Why? I mean, there's so many things we need to talk about there, including I just saw a note on the chat about at the moment in national markets, even in Europe, a national market of Germany, there are massive skyrocketing airfares, and Lufthansa has what would be called a monopoly in the German market. Why can't we break open all of those sorts of things?
Well, I mean, first of all, airfares have rocketed since COVID, but that I think is a short-term phenomenon. The airlines will compete those away. I mean, Fred Kahn, the father of US deregulation, once called aviation marginal costs with wings, and that summarizes the fundamental problem. There is airlines are intensely competitive and very quickly reduce fares to the absolute minimum. I mean, just before COVID, it was a period of where airlines were doing very well financially, and quite a good period. And yet a study by IATA showed that only 30 airlines in the whole world were actually truly profitable in terms of covering their cost of capital. In other words, being economically sustainable in the long run. And that's been the case for forever. The industry, I mean, there were loads of quotes of, you know, Warren Buffett saying that Wilbur Wright should have shot his brother at Kitty Hawk and benefited capitalists everywhere. I paraphrase, but the industry has never made, other than for a very short periods, true profits, and it's been bailed out by governments or by Chapter 11 type bankruptcies, and there's no obvious sign that has changed. And the reason for that, in my view, and I devote a whole chapter to this in my book. The reason, again, goes back to these stupid ownership and control rules, believe it or not. And the example I use is what happened in the United States. A few years ago, the United States carriers, the major carriers, were total basket cases. They were the biggest loss makers among airlines in the world. They couldn't compete. They were in a downward spiral. Move forward a few years, very, very few years, and they're the most profitable airlines in the world. So what happened? Well, what happened was you have consolidation, massive consolidation, so that now 80% of US domestic air services are controlled by just four big airlines. And that has had a dramatic impact. Of course, they could do that because they were all US airlines. There were US airlines merging with US airlines. You can't do that to the same extent across borders, and hence internationally, the industry remains loss-making. So again, everything comes back to these ownership and control rules, which stem back all the way to Chicago.
Back to 1944 or 45, I suppose, Bermuda, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that seems to me to be a key factor in the aviation industry, this inability to make long-term sustainable profits.
What did your ex-boss once say? How do you become a millionaire in aviation? Start out as a billionaire.
Yeah, let me tell you a story about that. He did say that because I wrote it for him and put it in a speech. And
you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. You heard it here first.
And I stole it from somebody else. It's now associated with Richard Branson, but actually he never made it up.
Right. Oh, well. It's a good quote, whoever made it up, and well done for spotting it. Of course, all these new competitors coming in, my ex-boss, James Strong, would have said there's always some putative biggles out there somewhere who can't wait to get into aviation for no reason that we can understand. The book doesn't just talk about airlines, of course. Aviation is significantly broader than just airlines. It's also airports, it's ATM, all the other things. So has the process been the same for airlines and for the ATC companies, the ANSPs?
No, very different. And I have a chapter on airports and on ATC regulation. Obviously, can't go into it in much detail as, say, the books by Peter Forsyth and Hans Martin and Marina do. They have whole books devoted to these subjects. But fundamentally, I do look in the case of ATC, for example. What I argue is that that's the last unrestructured, reformed sector of the aviation industry. It's still overwhelmingly government owned and controlled, and still even more nation based than the airlines. I mean, in Europe, there's so many individual ATC companies. It's just totally inefficient. But what's needed is, again, consolidation and reform. But again, it is like airlines in that reform runs up against political problems. I mean, to consolidate effectively means sacking well-paid air traffic controllers in one country and handing their jobs to people in another country. And in a business where air traffic control pays for itself, it's not a burden on governments usually. That's
not true, actually. I'm sorry. It's certainly not true in Europe. It's true in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, that they wash their own face. But in almost every other country on earth, it's still seen as a tax.
I was focusing on Europe in this.
I do beg your pardon.
Need to consolidate. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But yeah, so it's a big political decision for a government to say we're going to sack some of our own citizens and hand the jobs over to another country.
When they're such well-paid jobs as well.
Very well paid jobs. Yeah. I mean, I look at the various examples of attempted reform in the book. We've got the Canadian example and the British examples. I actually argue the Canadian example is the better one and the way to go, which essentially is a non-profit making organization with representation from stakeholders in the running of the company. The Americans are often highlighted as quite an efficient operation because they have a single unit for the whole country. But actually, because it's so tightly government controlled, it's not a good example at all. As far as airport regulation goes, there has been and continues to be quite a debate as to the way to go forward, whether you should have a free hand, a liberal approach, let airports more or less do what they want, or on the other extreme, tight control. And without going into the details here, I highlight the two aspects of that and discuss the arguments. I don't think there is an answer to it. There are examples of both types working, and examples of both types failing as well. So it's a difficult one. Airports are often, well, I argue very much that all airports are monopolies. It's just the extent of monopoly power varies enormously. So in the smaller airports, you do often get an element of competition. In the bigger ones, much less so. And of course, it's only the big airports that normally make money, and they make a lot of money. The smaller ones tend to be loss-making, but probably produce social benefits as well, which governments take into account.
Yeah, we're here to talk about your book, Barry, not my putative book. But I think in all honesty, people argue that airports are natural monopolies. I think they are completely unnatural monopolies. They're made to be monopolies by government decision. But there are no ownership and control restrictions on airports. Well, sorry, for liberalised airports, there are no ownership and control restrictions, are there?
No, and what you've had is significant cross-border consolidation. I mean,
well, indeed,
big companies, Vinci, for example, owned airports in all around the world, and
they're ahead of me. Yeah, indeed they do, and a number of other companies as well, and a lot of them, a lot of airport owners are things like in pension funds and things like that, desperately looking for steady state, steady investment opportunities. And in both of the liberalised ANSPs in the world, NATS and ENAV in Italy, again, that's the same point. I mean, we end up at a place where airports and ANSPs can make a profit and pay dividends back to their shareholders, whether it's the state itself or others. That tends to upset the airlines very enormously. Do you share the airlines' frustration on that?
These are monopolies, right? I think we agree. They're all monopolies. So if you have a monopoly, you need some form of regulatory control. If they're government owned, then there's always a supposition, whether it's right or wrong is debatable, but it's always a supposition that governments act in the interests of the consumer and the citizens, and therefore the extent of regulations you need is less. We've seen that with airports and to some extent with ATC. But the other NATS and ENAV are mostly privately owned, I believe. And
ENAV's 50-50, I think.
Yeah, okay, yeah, close to. So need some form of regulation. So whether the system works depends on the quality of the regulation. And so far, I would argue that the quality has not been particularly good around the world, especially in air traffic control. Air traffic control is incredibly technical and difficult to regulate. Not difficult for companies to pull the wool over the eyes of regulators and make life difficult for them. And I think if you look at the examples in detail, you see this happening. And the same is true to a lesser extent, but still to some extent with airports. I always use the example of Heathrow, where Heathrow's a monopoly. Even they admit, even Heathrow admits it's a total monopoly. So its whole future depends to a large extent on the regulatory outcome, getting the regulator to give it sufficient profits. So it can devote massive resources to achieving that end. Whereas for the airlines, airport charges are significant, but they're just one element in their total cost structure. And there's a limit to what they can devote to fighting the regulatory battles. So I think the whole thing is slightly unstable. And it's not surprising that companies like Heathrow have done rather well out of the regulatory system.
So what's the solution? Is the solution for the airports, for the airlines to own the airports? I mean, why are we so determined not to have a vertical industry, given that, what do? We go vertically upwards.
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that, of course, the airlines did buy a significant share of NATS in the UK, the Air Traffic Control Company, and were the controlling shareholders in that. And that investment, of which I was closely involved at the time, proved to be one of the best investments those airlines ever made. They didn't invest to make money, certainly. They invested to improve the quality of service, which they achieved as well. But they also made a lot of money out of it. They made more money out of that investment than from running their own airlines, significantly more, proportionately. And yet most of those original airline investors cashed in and moved away. They didn't want to continue long term to be shareholders in ATC, despite the fact they were making a lot of money and they were clearly having a positive impact on the quality of service. So why that is so, I do not know. I mean, I personally, I've always argued against that in Virgin, very much so. But it's something about air. Maybe it's because of their lack of long-term profitability, and they need to sell resources repeatedly. I mean, you see that with other in the distant past with airlines owning hotels or car hire companies, selling them as soon as they run into financial trouble and so forth. So maybe that's an element in there. But you're right. Vertical integration is could well be one of the answers.
Yeah, for what it's worth. It's mandatory in any podcast about aviation that we have to talk about sustainability. You've talked about financial sustainability. Let's talk about environmental sustainability. Your book has a chapter on that. What are your views?
It does, yeah. And I also touch on it in the conclusions as well, because obviously it's probably the big issue facing aviation today, and it's one of the reasons why I'm relatively pessimistic about the future, especially of the aviation business. The problem with the environment, I mean, obviously there are technical challenges and so forth, and real challenges to the ability of airlines to continue to expand. But it's also true that all of the solutions to the environmental problem come at a very high cost. There's no doubt at all that whatever happens, whether we have SAF or we have battery powered aircraft or we have hydrogen powered aircraft, whatever, it's all going to be a lot more expensive. It's going to add costs to the airline industry. And related to that is, in terms of cost reduction, technology has achieved far more for the aviation industry over the years than liberalization has done. I mean, the introduction of a jet engine and wide-bodied aircraft and high bypass engines and so forth really reduced costs massively, allowing lower fares, generating demand. But all the technology, not all, but overwhelmingly most of the technology now is focused on the environmental side, rather than, I don't see the equivalent of the wide-bodied aircraft or the high bypass engines in development now, not serious development. And the technology work going on, because it's focused on the environment, implies higher costs, not lower costs. So you add that to the growth of protectionism and the increased government involvement in airlines because of COVID and the increased debts of airlines as a result. It all points to costs over the medium term increasing significantly. And if your costs increase, then fares will increase. If fares increase, then demand will decline relatively. So that's not a very optimistic scenario for the future of the business. I'm not suggesting aviation is going to close down or anything, but there will be major challenges, I think, going forward in terms of maintaining the growth rates that we've been used to.
What you're certainly suggesting, I think, is there'll be significantly less growth. It will retreat to being a higher cost for consumers enterprise. Yet, does anyone on earth disagree that connectivity is a good thing, capital G, capital T? Why, with all this benefit coming out of aviation, are we left at the place where the government simply has to keep on stumping up the money and we just go round and round again?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I outlined one option for governments, but they are not able to deliver that, and changing the structure of the industry. But yes, I mean, I think aviation is extremely important, and we saw that during COVID. You know, the government stepped in. I wouldn't say willingly, but they did it on a massive scale, you know, there are people around who want to close down aviation. I think they're lunatics. I think they would not, you know, the result would be the absolute opposite of what they want to achieve. There would be mass starvation among the poorest nations of the world and so forth.
That actually interestingly segues beautifully to one of the questions on the chat, which is, all these benefits of liberalisation, why is Africa languishing so far behind? We've only got a couple of minutes, but have you got any thoughts on why the development is so patchy?
I mean, partly it's to do with the economic situation in Africa. You know, the demand for air services in Africa is relatively low. But I do talk in my book about the attempts to liberalize aviation in Africa, and in particular the attempts to replicate what Europe has done, and the Yamoussoukro Agreement, and it highlights again the political difficulties of making progress here. The countries are very willing to come together and talk about liberalisation and agree to liberalisation. It's the implementation that falls down and leads to failure. And the reason I come up with for explaining that is that there is no supranational organisation in Africa that can impose these rules. You have to remember that in Europe, liberalisation came about only because the Treaty of Rome has competition rules, and eventually the courts decided that those competition rules should apply to aviation, and that led directly to the liberalisation of air services. In Africa, there's not the equivalent of the European Court of Justice or to impose rules and make sure they are followed. So while it's easy to, as I say, easy to talk about liberalisation, implementing it has just proved to be impossible, and I don't see any short-term answer to that.
Yeah, that's But that could be the slogan, or that could be the motto from aviation generally, isn't it? It's easy to talk about liberalisation. It's actually been quite hard to impose.
Very good, yes.
Yeah. So just for everybody, I've put the title of the book, the cover of the book back up, but I've actually got some good news for you, further good news, apart from this, I think, absolutely fascinating conversation we've been having, which is that Barry and his publishers have come together. And if I can find the message, I thought I had it here. There is a code for you to get the book at a discount price. And here it is. So let me just put this up on the screen as well. Barry, do you want to just explain who the publishers are? And well, it says it published by Routledge. And this is the discount code you need to get a discount of 30%.
Yeah.
Is that, have I done that correctly?
There you have, perfectly. Yes, I hope it works. That's what the publisher told me anyway.
Good-o. Good-o. So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but I think this has been absolutely fascinating, and I can assure you it's an excellent book, and it's extremely well written and written by someone who's literally there, at the coalface, in the trenches. And so, I'd like to take this opportunity, Barry, to thank you for your time and indeed for writing the book, and to all of you, ladies and gentlemen out there, I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and I look forward to talking to you very soon. I should also point out, of course, that the European Aviation Conference is having its annual conference in Luxembourg at the end of November. Do please go on to the European Aviation Conference website to try to find further details about that, because I think putting up a third slide on my screen would just destroy my technical abilities. So Barry, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for sharing.
Cheers.